The sun was dipping low over the wide plains of New Mexico, painting the horizon in strokes of amber and fire, when rancher Samuel Hayes noticed something unusual along the dusty trail leading back to his homestead. At first, he thought it was just a bundle of brush caught against a rock, but as he drew closer on horseback, his sharp eyes caught the faint movement of a hand. His heart tightened. Lying half buried in the dirt was a young native warrior, his chest rising shallowly, his clothes torn and soaked with blood from a deep wound across his side. Samuel knew the dangers of such a discovery. Tensions between settlers and tribes were fragile as glass, and many of his neighbors would have left the man to die without a second thought. But Samuel was cut from a different cloth. He dismounted slowly, knelt beside the wounded figure, and reached for his canteen. The warrior's cracked lips parted, and Samuel poured water carefully, watching as the man drank with desperate gratitude. No words were spoken, only a silent bond forged in that moment, one man giving mercy to another. Samuel tended the wound as best he could, tearing a strip from his own shirt to press against it. When the warrior's heavy eyes closed, Samuel carried him off the trail, laying him beneath the shade of a mesquite tree where he might rest unseen. Samuel didn't expect thanks, nor did he expect to see the man again. He only knew it was the right thing to do. As he rode back toward his ranch, the prairie winds whispered across the grasslands, carrying with them a strange sense of weight, as if the land itself had witnessed his choice. What Samuel could not know was that this small act of compassion would not fade into the dust. It would ripple outward, drawing the eyes of an entire people. And when the next dawn broke, the earth would tremble under the thunder of hooves as tribes from miles around rode to his land, not in anger, but in a force that would test the very measure of who Samuel Hayes truly was. Morning came quietly at first, with the gentle chirping of meadowlarks and the slow sweep of light crawling over the rolling hills. But Samuel Hayes awoke with an uneasy feeling in his chest. He stepped onto his porch, mug of coffee in hand, and let his gaze wander across the open range, expecting to see nothing more than cattle grazing and the usual dust stirred by the wind. Instead, in the far distance, a dark line shimmered against the horizon. At first he thought it was a trick of the dawn haze, but soon the line grew thicker, moving, alive, a tide of horsemen riding in unison. His breath caught, dozens, then scores. Then what seemed like hundreds of native riders appeared, their silhouettes framed by the rising sun, feathers and lances glinting, their horses pounding the earth like a living storm. Samuel's neighbors often spoke in hushed tones about raids, about the wrath of tribes who had seen their lands stolen, but nothing could have prepared him for the sight of an entire nation of riders approaching his ranch. His first thought leapt to the wounded warrior he had given water to. Could this be his people, come to reclaim him, or worse, to punish Samuel for laying hands upon him? Fear prickled his spine, yet beneath it was a strange calm, a recognition that yesterday's choice was now bearing its consequences. He set his mug down, squared his shoulders, and walked out toward the fence line, refusing to hide. The thunder of hooves drew nearer, shaking the very ground beneath his boots, until at last the vanguard of riders came into full view. Painted faces, stern eyes, bows and rifles at their sides, yet not a single shot was fired. They slowed, surrounding his ranch in a great half-circle, horses snorting and stamping as dust clouded the air. Then the crowd parted, and through the line rode the same young warrior Samuel had aided, upright now though still bandaged. His dark eyes locked on Samuel's with a fire that was not anger, but something deeper. A hush fell over the gathering as the warrior raised his hand in a gesture of recognition. Behind him, elders and chieftains studied Samuel with unreadable expressions. As if weighing his soul, Samuel felt the weight of history pressing down upon him, the knowledge that one simple act of kindness had called forth an entire people. And though he did not yet know what judgment they would pass, he stood rooted, unflinching, ready to meet it with the same quiet conviction that had guided him the day before. The silence that hung in the air was heavier than any gunfire Samuel had ever heard, for in that stillness rested the decision of hundreds of riders, each one capable of unleashing fury upon his land. Dust floated like a veil, catching the early light as Samuel and the young warrior faced each other, two men bound by a single moment of mercy. Then, slowly, the warrior dismounted, his movements deliberate, his steps uneven but strong with pride. He spoke words in his native tongue, his voice low and firm, and though Samuel could not understand their meaning, the tone carried gratitude. An elder followed, his hair white as snow and his eyes deep with the weight of countless seasons. He too dismounted, lifting his hand toward Samuel in a gesture that was not hostile but solemn. The rancher's pulse thundered, yet he held his ground, his calloused hands resting at his sides, showing no weapon. Whispers rippled through the gathered tribes, the sound like wind through tall grass, until the elder's words rose above them all. The wounded warrior translated haltingly, his voice breaking with emotion. "You gave water when the earth was thirsty. You gave life when death had nearly taken me. Our people see this, and we remember." Samuel swallowed hard, a mixture of relief and disbelief washing over him. He had expected anger, perhaps even bloodshed. Yet here stood men who had come not to destroy but to acknowledge. Still, the weight of their presence was no less intimidating. One misstep, one wrong word, and everything could unravel. Samuel cleared his throat and spoke with the plain honesty of a rancher, saying he had done what any man ought to do, to help another who was suffering, no matter where he came from. His voice carried across the circle, steady though his heart raced, and the elders listened in silence. Then, like the breaking of a storm, a cheer rose from the younger riders, their spears lifted skyward, their voices echoing against the wide plains. It was not a war cry, but a song of honor, a declaration that Samuel Hayes had, in their eyes, proven himself a man of respect. The elder stepped closer, his weathered hand brushing Samuel's shoulder, and in that simple touch was the sealing of an unspoken pact, a bond between the rancher and the people, whose land stretched far beyond his fence posts. As the sun climbed higher, its golden light bathed the entire scene, and Samuel knew that the choice he had made out of quiet compassion had set into motion something larger than himself, something that would ripple across the land in ways he could not yet imagine. The tribes did not linger to raid or to take. They remained to stand in silent acknowledgement before riding on, their departure as powerful as their arrival, leaving Samuel with a ranch unchanged in sight, but forever altered in spirit. When the dust of the departing riders settled, and the thunder of their hooves faded into the distance, Samuel Hayes found himself standing alone in the middle of his ranch yard, the silence almost surreal after such a spectacle. The cattle grazed calmly as if nothing had happened. The wind whispered through the prairie grass as it always did, and yet Samuel knew deep in his bones that the world he lived in had shifted. That very evening, word of the tribe's gathering spread like wildfire through the nearby town, carried by riders who had witnessed the spectacle from afar. By the time Samuel rode in for supplies, whispers turned to stares, and stares into open questions. Men leaned on saloon doors, women paused at the well, and children followed him with wide eyes as if he were a figure out of legend. "They say 100 braves circled your ranch," muttered one storekeeper with a mixture of awe and suspicion. "And yet you still stand, not a bullet fired." Others weren't so charitable. A neighbor by the name of Carter spat into the dust and growled, "You'll bring them down on all of us. Hayes, making friends with their kind. One day, you'll regret it." Samuel listened without raising his voice, knowing that fear often spoke louder than reason, and he carried his supplies without answering. Later that night, alone by the fire in his modest home, the rancher replayed every detail, the weight of the elder's hand on his shoulder, the cheer of the young warriors, the gratitude in the wounded man's eyes. He asked himself if he had done right, not just for the sake of his own conscience, but for what it meant in the eyes of two worlds colliding on the same land. He thought of the stories he had heard growing up, tales of bloodshed between settlers and tribes, each side painting the other as savage or thief. And yet, when he looked into the eyes of that young warrior, he had not seen a savage but a man, wounded and thirsty, clinging to life. The memory hardened Samuel's resolve. He would not let the town's fear undo what had been forged in that moment of mercy. If the tribes had chosen to honor his act, then he would honor their trust in return. But as the flames crackled lower and shadows deepened on the walls, Samuel knew that his decision had placed him at a crossroads. The trust of an entire people was a gift, but it was also a burden, and soon he would be forced to choose between standing firm in compassion or bending under the weight of suspicion that his neighbors carried. Outside, the The night wind carried faint echoes across the plains, like distant drums on the horizon, and Samuel wondered if the story was only beginning